Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we examine a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is February 21st. On this day in 1965, civil rights leader Malcolm X was assassinated in New York City. It was an event that sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. But Malcolm X was more than just a political figure. He was a father, a husband, and a man whose transformation from a troubled youth to an international icon inspired millions. Today, we'll explore his life, the circumstances that led to his tragic death, the investigation that followed, and how his legacy continues to impact society today. Let's get started. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. His early life was marked by hardship and racial violence. His father, Earl Little, a Baptist minister and follower of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement, faced relentless threats from white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father was found dead under suspicious circumstances. His death was officially ruled an accident, though many believed it to be a racially motivated murder. In the years that followed, Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, struggled to support her 8 children, eventually leading to her institutionalization. This fractured the Little family, and Malcolm and his siblings were sent to different foster homes. As a young man, Malcolm moved between Boston and Harlem, falling into a life of crime that ultimately led to his arrest for burglary in 1946. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and it was during this incarceration that Malcolm underwent a profound transformation. While incarcerated, he was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, NOI, a religious and social movement advocating for Black empowerment and self-reliance. Inspired by its leader, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm embraced the NOI's beliefs, rejecting his slave surname and adopting the name Malcolm X to symbolize his lost African ancestry. Upon his release from prison in 1952, Malcolm quickly rose within the ranks of the NOI. His sharp intellect, commanding presence, and unwavering commitment to justice made him a powerful voice for Black liberation. He opened new mosques, engaged in national debates, and gained prominence through media appearances. However, Malcolm's calls for self-defense and his critique of the mainstream civil rights movement, particularly its emphasis on nonviolence, drew both admiration and controversy. He became a polarizing figure, hailed by some as a fearless truth-teller and condemned by others as a dangerous radical. Despite his success within the NOI, tensions between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad began to mount. Their relationship fractured over ideological differences, as well as Malcolm's growing awareness of Muhammad's personal scandals, including allegations of inappropriate relationships with young women within the NOI. The breaking point came in 1963 following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Malcolm's remark that Kennedy's death was a case of, quote, chickens coming home to roost, end quote, was widely criticized, leading Elijah Muhammad to silence him from public speaking for 90 days. By March 1964, Malcolm formally left the Nation of Islam, determined to forge a path rooted in a broader vision of human rights and racial unity. That same year, Malcolm made a pilgrim to Mecca, and that journey profoundly reshaped his worldview. Witnessing Muslims of all races praying side by side, Malcolm began to advocate for racial solidarity across ethnic lines, moving away from NOI's message of racial separatism. Upon returning to the United States, he founded 2 new organizations, Muslim Mosque Inc., which was dedicated to Islamic spirituality, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which focused on uniting African Americans in the fight for civil rights. Malcolm's evolving message, which now emphasized global human rights, economic empowerment, and political activism, marked a new chapter in his life. Yet, it also deepened the threats against him, including some from members of the NOI. By early 1965, the danger surrounding Malcolm X had become impossible to ignore. He received constant death threats, and tensions within the NOI had reached a boiling point. On February 14th, his home in Queens, New York was firebombed while he, his wife, Betty Shabazz, and their 4 daughters were inside. Miraculously, no one was injured, but the message was clear. Malcolm X's life was in imminent danger. Just a week later, on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan's Washington Heights neighborhood to deliver a speech to a crowd of roughly 400 people. As he began speaking, a commotion broke out. Someone in the crowd shouted, quote, "N-word, get your hand out of my pocket," end quote. In the ensuing chaos, a man rushed forward and shot Malcolm once in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun. 2 other assailants then fired semi-automatic handguns, striking him multiple times. Malcolm collapsed as his wife and others rushed to his side. The gunmen fled, but one, Mujahid Abdul Halim, also known as Thomas Hagen, was captured at the scene by enraged bystanders. Despite efforts to save him, Malcolm X was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. An autopsy later revealed 21 gunshot wounds to his chest, left shoulder, arms, and legs, with 10 buckshot wounds from the initial blast. The assassination of Malcolm X sent shockwaves through the United States and beyond, but reactions were mixed. His supporters mourned the loss of a visionary leader whose voice had inspired millions, but his critics, including many mainstream media publications, portrayed his death as the inevitable result of his radical views. The New York Times editorialized that Malcolm was, quote, "an irresponsible demagogue," and, quote, "an extraordinary and twisted man," while the Time magazine declared that the dead leader was, quote, "an unashamed demagogue whose, quote, gospel was hatred." However, others saw Malcolm X much more clearly and recognized his profound impact on the civil rights movement and his unwavering commitment to the liberation of Black people. In the days following the assassination, police arrested Norman 3X Butler, later known as Muhammad Abdulaziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, later known as Khalil Islam, for Malcolm X's murder. They were both members of NOI's Harlem Mosque. Meanwhile, Mujahid Abdul Halim, the only gunman captured at the scene after being severely beaten by the crowd, confessed to his role but insisted that Aziz and Islam were both innocent. The trial of the 3 men began in January 1966. The prosecution's case relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Despite Halim's confession and lack of physical evidence linking Aziz and Islam to the crime, all 3 were found guilty of first-degree murder in March 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. For decades, doubts persisted about the convictions of Aziz and Islam. Halim repeatedly named other individuals from NOI's Newark Mosque as his accomplices, but law enforcement showed little interest in listening to him or reopening the case. It wasn't until the release of the 2020 Netflix docuseries Who Killed Malcolm X that the case received renewed attention. The series exposed critical evidence withheld during the original trial, including FBI and NYPD documents that suggested that Aziz and Islam were not even at the Audubon Ballroom that day. In response to the public outcry, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office re-examined their convictions. Their investigation uncovered that the FBI and the NYPD had withheld exculpatory evidence during the original trial, which could have influenced the verdicts. On November 18, 2021, after more than 55 years, Muhammad Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam were officially exonerated. Aziz had been paroled in 1985 and Islam had been paroled in 1987. But unfortunately, Khalil Islam did not live long enough to see his name cleared. He passed away in 2009. Following their exonerations, Aziz and Islam's family sought compensation for their wrongful imprisonment. In October 2022, the city of New York settled with Aziz and with Islam's estate for $26 million. The state of New York added an additional $10 million, bringing the total settlement to $36 million. The New York City Law Department issued a statement regretting the wrongful conviction of Aziz and Islam that stated in part, quote, "This settlement brings some measure of justice to individuals who spent decades in prison and bore the stigma of being falsely accused of murdering an iconic figure," end quote. Yet, even with all of this, many questions remain. Did government agencies like the FBI and NYPD play a more direct role in Malcolm X's assassination? Was the NOI solely responsible, or were other forces involved? And why did it take so long and a Netflix documentary for the truth to come out? Many believe that FBI's COINTELPRO program, which sought to disrupt and neutralize civil rights leaders, played a role in both the assassination and the cover-up. In 2023, Malcolm X's family announced plans to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the NYPD, FBI, and CIA, alleging that these agencies conspired to facilitate and cover up his murder. Malcolm X's death marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. His fearless advocacy for Black empowerment and human rights continues to inspire new generations of activists. His autobiography, written by Alex Haley, remains a cornerstone of American literature and offers an intimate look at the evolution from anger and despair to wisdom and compassion. But this assassination and the decades-long injustice that followed also serve as a reminder of the systemic racism within the American criminal justice system. Malcolm X once said, quote, "The future belongs for those who prepare for it today," end quote. His life and legacy continue to shape the fight for racial justice, not just in the United States, but all around the world. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!